Montana Territory, 1874. The small settlement of Timber Creek sat like a defiant outpost against nature's vast indifference. Delilah Jenkins stood at the window of her aunt's modest boarding house, watching the horizon where the mountains met the sky with an unyielding wall of stone. Much like those mountains, she had built walls of her own, walls that kept her standing when everything else had crumbled. At 22, Delilah's honey-blonde hair and delicate features belied the steel in her spine. Today she wore a simple blue calico dress, patched at the elbows but meticulously clean. Her green eyes, once bright with dreams of love and family, now carried the wary look of someone who had learned the hardest lesson the frontier could teach. Trust was a luxury few could afford. 3 months ago, she had stood in the small whitewashed church at the edge of town, white satin draped over her trembling form, flowers woven through her hair. The townsfolk had gathered, whispers of admiration following her down the aisle where Samuel Preston, son of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, was meant to be waiting. But Samuel never came. Love is just a pretty lie people tell themselves to feel less alone in this wilderness, Delilah murmured to herself as she wiped down the boarding house tables with unnecessary force. The only thing that matters out here is what you can count on, yourself. Her Aunt Martha, a widow who had survived 20 harsh winters in the territory, looked up from her mending. That may be what you tell yourself now, child, but a heart wasn't made to beat alone, no matter how wild the country around it. Delilah shook her head. My heart is just fine keeping time for me and no one else. What she wanted now was simple: to work, to save, and eventually to purchase the small millinery shop when Mrs. Hollister returned east. Independence was the only protection worth having. What she couldn't admit, even to herself, was how the nights stretched long and empty, how the sound of families laughing together in the street made her throat ache with unspoken yearning. In Timber Creek, where survival demanded community, her isolation was both shield and wound. That evening, as Delilah collected eggs from the henhouse behind the boarding house, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Riders were common enough, but something about the steady, unhurried rhythm made her step out to look. A group of cattle drovers was coming into town, trail dust coating their clothes and horses. Leading them was a young man she'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with a straight back and an easy way of sitting his horse that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. Unlike many of the rough men who passed through town, there was something immediately different about him. Perhaps the way his eyes seemed to take in everything with quiet attention, or how the men around him deferred to him despite his youth. At 25, Colton Irwin had already seen more of the West than most men twice his age. His light brown hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and 3 days of trail stubble didn't hide the clean lines of his jaw. He'd learned cattle driving from his father, but after losing both parents to fever 2 years prior, he'd taken to the trail full-time, moving between ranches and drives where his skill with horses and calm management of men earned him quick respect. What people didn't know was how each mile under endless sky only deepened his belief that a man wasn't meant to drift forever. His parents' love had been the anchor of his childhood, and its absence left him with the conviction that without someone to share it with, all the land and freedom in the West meant nothing. We'll stop here for 2 days, he called to his men as they approached the livery. Get the cattle settled in the holding pen south of town. Then you're free until dawn day after tomorrow. The men nodded, some already eyeing the saloon with undisguised longing. As Colton dismounted, leading his chestnut gelding toward the water trough, he noticed the young woman by the henhouse, her golden hair catching the last rays of sunset. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty street, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition between two souls who had learned to guard themselves carefully. Delilah looked away first, clutching her basket of eggs closer to her chest. Another drifter, another man who would be gone with the next sunrise or the next job. Not worth a second glance. But fate had other plans for Timber Creek that evening. The incident that changed everything happened just after dusk. Delilah was returning from delivering a basket of fresh bread to the widow Patterson when the sound of splintering wood and panicked whinnies split the evening calm. A team of horses pulling a heavily loaded wagon had spooked at something on the edge of town. The driver was thrown clear, but the wagon careened wildly down the main street, the terrified horses bolting straight toward the boarding house porch where Martha sat rocking, unaware of the danger. Delilah dropped the empty basket and ran, her heart hammering in her chest, but she was too far away. "Aunt Martha!" she screamed. In that moment, Colton burst from the saloon doorway. Assessing the situation in a single glance, he sprinted toward the horses. With the timing born of years working with frightened animals, he leapt for the lead horse's bridle, using his weight to turn the team. The wagon tilted dangerously, scraping against the corner of the porch before coming to a shuddering halt mere feet from where Martha sat frozen in shock. The force of the stop threw Colton to the ground. He rolled and came up favoring his left arm, but his first words were for the older woman. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Martha shook her head, speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Delilah reached them, chest heaving from her sprint. "Aunt Martha!" She embraced her aunt, then turned to the cowboy who stood quietly calming the still nervous horses. "You saved her life." Colton shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Delilah said with quiet certainty. "They wouldn't have." Later that night, after the excitement had died down and the owner of the wagon had been thoroughly dressed down by the sheriff, Delilah found herself tending to Colton's injured arm in the boarding house kitchen. It wasn't broken, but a nasty gash ran from elbow to wrist. "This needs stitches," she said, cleaning the wound with a steady hand that belied her inner turmoil. Being this close to him, noticing the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he winced, how he smelled of leather and open prairie, unsettled her in ways she wasn't prepared for. "I've had worse," he replied, watching her work. "You're good at this. My father was a doctor before." She trailed off, before the fever took him and her mother both, leaving her alone at 16 until Aunt Martha had taken her in. "I used to assist him sometimes." As she worked, Martha bustled around them, insisting that Colton take a room at the boarding house during his stay in town. "At a reduced rate, of course, considering what you did today." "That's kind, but unnecessary." "Nonsense," Martha interrupted. "It's decided. And you'll take your meals with us, too. That trail food can't be good for a growing boy." Colton glanced at Delilah, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Is she always this, unstoppable?" "Yes." Delilah found herself smiling despite her determination to keep her distance. Over the next 2 days, an unexpected rhythm developed. Colton would leave at dawn to check on his cattle and men, returning for the midday meal where Martha would press second helpings on him and ask endless questions about his travels. Delilah remained reserved, but found herself lingering at the table longer than necessary, drawn to his stories of distant places and the quiet strength he carried without arrogance. On the evening before he was set to leave, Colton found Delilah alone on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. "Your aunt mentioned what happened to you," he said without preamble, leaning against the porch rail. Being left like that, it wasn't right. Delilah stiffened. "Aunt Martha talks too much. She loves you. And I wish she wouldn't share my humiliation with strangers." Colton turned to face her fully. "Is that what you think it was? Humiliation? What else would you call being abandoned at the altar in front of the entire town?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "I'd call it someone else's cowardice having nothing to do with your worth." The simple statement, delivered without pity or condescension, struck Delilah speechless. Before she could respond, Colton continued. "I've crossed paths with men like Preston before. Men who make promises with no intention of keeping them because they've never had to face consequences." His voice hardened. "That kind of man isn't worth your tears, much less your shame." "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment," Delilah said, but the words lacked conviction. "Maybe not," he agreed easily. "But I know what I've seen in the time I've been here. I've seen how you care for your aunt, how you remember Mrs. Patterson likes her bread with extra crust, how you slip extra eggs to the Ferguson children when their father isn't looking." He paused. "A person who does those things doesn't deserve what happened to you." Something warm and dangerous unfurled in Delilah's chest. "You notice a lot for someone just passing through." His gaze was steady. "Some things are worth noticing." The next morning, Colton and his men prepared to move the cattle onward to the railhead at Helena. Delilah told herself she wasn't watching from the window, just happening to straighten the curtains when he led his horse from the stable. To her surprise, instead of mounting immediately, Colton turned toward the boarding house. Their eyes met through the glass, and after a moment's hesitation, Delilah stepped onto the porch. I wanted to thank you for the hospitality, he said, hat in hand. It was Aunt Martha's doing. A half-smile crossed his face. Not entirely. The silence stretched between them, filled with words neither knew how to say after such brief acquaintance. Finally, Colton spoke. I'll be back this way in about 6 weeks, after we deliver the herd. He hesitated. Would it be all right if I called on you then? Delilah's carefully constructed defenses wavered. Why would you want to? Because in 3 days, you're the first person who's made me think twice about moving on. The honest admission hung in the air between them. Before she could answer, one of his men called from down the street. Colton nodded in acknowledgement, then turned back to Delilah. You don't have to answer now. Just think about it. He placed his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a gentle salute, and walked away. Delilah watched him go, a strange lightness in her chest warring with the familiar weight of caution. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to rebuild the walls his kindness had begun to erode. But life on the frontier rarely followed expected paths. 3 weeks later, as summer heat baked the town, rumors spread of increased Indian raids to the north, where Colton's cattle drive would be passing. Though she told herself it was foolish to worry about a man she barely knew, Delilah found herself scanning every rider who entered town, relief and disappointment warring when none proved to be him. For weeks after his departure, a battered stagecoach arrived carrying unexpected trouble. Samuel Preston returned to Timber Creek, his father's fortune behind him and a plan to expand their ranch holdings, beginning with foreclosing on several struggling homesteads, including the land where Martha's boarding house stood. It's just business, Samuel explained smoothly when he encountered Delilah at the general store. His smile held the same charm that had once made her heart race. Now it only made her skin crawl. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? Delilah repeated, incredulous. You left me standing alone in a wedding dress, and now you want to take my aunts home. What part of that isn't personal, Samuel? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. That unfortunate incident was a mistake. I wasn't ready for marriage. But you're ready to destroy people's lives for profit? His expression hardened. This territory is changing, Delilah. Those who can't keep up will be left behind. Your aunt has 3 weeks to settle her debts or find new accommodation. He tipped his hat with mocking politeness. Good day. That evening, as Delilah helped Martha review their meager savings, the older woman sighed heavily. We're short by more than half, even if we sell my mother's silver. There must be something we can do, Delilah insisted, refusing to accept defeat. Martha patted her hand. Perhaps it's time I considered that offer from my sister in St. Louis. To leave Timber Creek? This is your home. Homes can be rebuilt, dear. It's the people in them that matter. Delilah spent a sleepless night calculating figures that refused to add up to salvation. By morning, she had made a desperate decision. The millinery shop might be beyond her reach now, but she still had her skills as a seamstress and her father's medical knowledge. If she could secure work as a trail cook or camp helper with one of the cattle outfits passing through, she might earn enough to at least secure a small cabin for Martha. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A cattle buyer named Harris arrived in town the next day, seeking replacement hands for a drive that had lost men to illness. I need someone who can cook and handle basic doctoring, he explained when Delilah approached him outside the general store. But it's no place for a woman alone. I'm stronger than I look, she countered. And I need the work urgently. Harris studied her for a long moment. It's Irwin's outfit, he said finally. Lost their cook and a hand to mountain fever. They're camped 10 miles north, waiting for replacements before continuing to Helena. Colton's outfit. The knowledge sent an unexpected thrill through her. I'll take it. 2 days later, Delilah sat beside Harris in his wagon, heading north with supplies and her small trunk of possessions. Martha had protested but ultimately understood the necessity. Just be careful, she'd warned. Men on the trail aren't like men in town. As they approached the camp, Delilah's confidence wavered. What if Colton didn't welcome her presence? What if his interest had been mere politeness? But necessity drove her forward. This wasn't about him. It was about saving the only home she had left. The camp came into view as they crested a small rise. Wagons, cattle, and men moving with purpose around a central cook fire. Harris pulled the wagon to a stop and called out a greeting. And then Colton was there, emerging from among the men, surprise registering on his face as he recognized her. Miss Jenkins. His gaze shifted between her and Harris, confusion evident. Harris gestured toward her. Your replacement cook and medic, as requested. Comes highly recommended by half the town. Colton's expression was unreadable. I need to speak with Miss Jenkins alone. Once Harris had moved away, Colton stepped closer to the wagon. What are you doing here, Delilah? This is no place for— If you say no place for a woman, I will turn this wagon around immediately, she interrupted. I need this job, Mr. Irwin, and I am fully capable of cooking for your men and tending to basic medical needs. That's not what I meant, he said more gently. It's dangerous out here. We've had reports of raiders in the territory. I'm aware of the risks. She met his gaze steadily. I wouldn't be here if I had other options. Something in her voice must have communicated her desperation, for his expression softened. What happened? Briefly, she explained the situation with Samuel and the boarding house. As she spoke, Colton's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. So Preston shows up after abandoning you and now wants to take your home too? The quiet fury in his voice surprised her. It's business to him, she said bitterly. It's wrong, is what it is. He was silent for a moment, then nodded decisively. You can stay. We need a cook, and Doc Miller said you have medical training. But you'll need to follow orders without question if there's trouble. My men are good men, but I'll make it clear you're to be treated with respect. Relief washed through her. Thank you. Life on the cattle drive proved both harder and more rewarding than Delilah had anticipated. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, worked through the day preparing food and tending to minor injuries, and fell exhausted into her small tent each night. But there was also an unexpected freedom in the open country, a sense of purpose in being needed. And then there was Colton. He kept a respectful distance during the day, professional and proper before his men. But each evening, as the camp settled, he would find his way to the cook fire where Delilah worked, offering to help with cleanup or simply sitting in companionable silence as the stars emerged overhead. On their fifth night on the trail, as Delilah stirred a pot of beans for the next day's breakfast, Colton approached with an armful of firewood. The men are saying you make better biscuits than old Pete ever did, he remarked, stacking the wood neatly. Delilah smiled despite herself. High praise indeed. They're right. He settled on a log across from her. Though I suspect they're equally impressed by how you stitched up Rodriguez's hand yesterday without him fainting. Men are such children about needles, she said, but there was no mockery in her tone. Colton laughed, the sound warm in the gathering dusk. True enough. He watched her work for a moment. You seem different out here. Different how? She glanced up at him. More yourself, somehow. He gestured vaguely. In town, you always seem to be holding something back. Out here you're, I don't know, freer. The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Perhaps I am, she admitted. In town, everyone knows me as poor Delilah Jenkins, left at the altar. Out here, I'm just the cook who can stitch a wound. You were never poor Delilah to me, he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice made her hands still. What was I then? His eyes held hers across the fire. The woman who caught my attention the moment I saw her collecting eggs in the sunset. The woman whose strength I recognized even before I knew her story. Heat that had nothing to do with the fire rose to Delilah's cheeks. Before she could respond, a shout went up from the night watch at the edge of camp. Colton was on his feet instantly, hand going to the gun at his hip. Stay here, he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice as he strode toward the commotion. Delilah watched anxiously as men gathered around a rider who had just entered camp. The newcomer's horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting hard riding. When Colton turned back toward the fire, his expression was grim. Trouble? She asked as he approached. Raid on a homestead 15 miles east of here, he confirmed. Family made it to safety, but they lost everything. And the raiders are reportedly heading this direction. He ran a hand through his hair. We're changing course tomorrow. We'll head west toward the mountains, try to avoid their path. The new route would add days to their journey, days the cattle might struggle to find adequate grazing, days that would delay Delilah's return and payment. How long will it add to the drive? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Colton heard the worry beneath her question. 4 days, maybe 5. He hesitated. I know what you're thinking, but Preston won't move against your aunt until the full 3 weeks are up. We'll still make it back in time. His confidence should have reassured her. Instead, It only heightened her awareness of how much was at stake, and how quickly she had come to depend on this man she barely knew. The next morning broke gray and threatening, with heavy clouds building to the east. As the camp broke and the cattle were gathered for the day's drive, a tension hung in the air that even the animals seemed to sense. Colton rode up and down the line, checking on his men and the herd, his gaze repeatedly scanning the horizon. By midday, the storm that had threatened all morning broke over them with startling ferocity. Lightning split the sky as rain pounded the earth, turning the trail to mud and spooking the already nervous cattle. "Get the wagon to higher ground," Colton shouted to Delilah as he raced past, his horse splashing through rapidly forming puddles. "Head for those trees on the ridge." Delilah fought to control the team as thunder crashed overhead. The normally docile horses strained against the harness, eyes rolling in fear. Behind her, she could hear the bellowing of cattle and the shouts of men as they struggled to prevent a stampede. The wheels of the wagon slid in the mud as she guided the team toward the ridge Colton had indicated. Rain lashed her face, making it difficult to see. Just as she reached the trees, a particularly violent crash of thunder directly overhead sent the team lurching sideways. The wagon tipped precariously, then slid down the far side of the ridge, coming to rest against a tree with a splintering crack. Delilah was thrown clear, landing hard on the sodden ground. For a moment, she lay stunned, the rain beating down on her face. Then she struggled to her feet, assessing herself for injuries. Nothing seemed broken, though her shoulder ached fiercely where she had struck the ground. The horses had broken free in the crash and were nowhere to be seen. The wagon itself was tilted at an angle, one wheel shattered against the tree. Inside, supplies were scattered and soaked, but the precious medical kit was still intact in its waterproof case. Grabbing the kit and her rain slicker from the wreckage, Delilah made her way back toward the ridge. The storm was beginning to abate, but visibility remained poor. She had no idea which direction the herd had gone, or where Colton and his men might be. "Hello," she called, her voice small against the diminishing rain. "Can anyone hear me?" Only the dripping of water from the trees answered her. Fighting down rising panic, Delilah tried to orient herself. The ridge she had tried to reach was behind her, and the trail they had been following should be on the other side. If she could get back to that ridge, she might be able to spot the herd. She had made it halfway up the slippery slope when a sound froze her in place. Hoofbeats, approaching rapidly. Relief washed through her. Someone from the drive had found her. But as she turned toward the sound, the relief curdled into fear. 3 riders emerged from the rain, none of them familiar. Their faces were hard, their clothes a mismatched assortment that marked them as neither cowboys nor homesteaders. Raiders. Delilah ducked behind a fallen log, heart hammering in her chest. The men rode directly to the overturned wagon, dismounting to inspect its contents. "Not much here," one called, rifling through the scattered supplies. "Some food, cooking gear. Check for valuables," ordered the tallest of the 3, a man with a puckered scar running down one side of his face. These cattle drives sometimes carry cash for the men. As they searched, Delilah began to edge backward, hoping to escape unnoticed. A loose stone shifted under her foot, tumbling down the slope with a soft rattle. The scarred man's head snapped up. "Someone's here," he said sharply, drawing his pistol. "Fan out." Abandoning stealth for speed, Delilah turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as shouts rose behind her. She had no clear direction, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the raiders. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from a tree near her head. Delilah veered sharply right, plunging deeper into the wooded area. The ground sloped downward, becoming steeper until she was half running, half sliding down a ravine. At the bottom, a swift-flowing creek, swollen from the rain, blocked her path. The water looked dangerously fast, but the sound of pursuit was growing closer. With no time to hesitate, Delilah waded in, gasping as the cold water rose to her waist. The current tugged at her skirts, threatening to pull her under. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a moss-covered stone. The current caught her, sweeping her downstream as she fought to keep her head above water. The medical kit, still clutched in one hand, dragged at her arm like an anchor. Just as she thought her strength would give out, the creek took a sharp bend, throwing her against a fallen tree that spanned part of the water. Delilah clung to it, dragging herself hand over hand until she reached the opposite bank. Soaked and shivering, she crawled into the shelter of a dense thicket, straining to hear over the sound of the water. No voices, no hoofbeats. The raiders must have lost her trail at the creek. As the immediate danger passed, a new fear took hold. She was alone, lost, with night approaching and no idea where to find Colton and the others. The storm had cleared, but the temperature was dropping rapidly with the setting sun. In wet clothes, exposure could kill her as surely as any raider's bullet. Fighting back tears of exhaustion and fear, Delilah forced herself to think practically. She needed to find shelter and build a fire before dark. The medical kit contained waterproof matches, at least, and she needed to get to high ground at first light to try to spot the cattle drive. One step at a time, she murmured to herself, her father's old advice for treating patients. Just take one step at a time. By the time full darkness fell, Delilah had constructed a crude shelter beneath an overhanging rock face and managed to start a small fire with damp wood that smoked more than it burned. Her dress and petticoats hung from branches nearby, hopefully drying by morning. Wrapped in her rain slicker, she huddled as close to the meager fire as she dared, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Every sound from the forest around her sent a fresh spike of fear through her body. Yet despite the danger and discomfort, her thoughts kept returning to Colton. Was he searching for her? Was he safe? Had the herd stampeded in the storm? He'll find me, she whispered to herself, needing to hear the words aloud. He'll come. Even as she said it, the doubt that had been her companion since Samuel's betrayal whispered back. Why would he? Men leave. They always leave in the end. Delilah woke with a start as first light filtered through the trees. Her fire had died to embers, and every muscle in her body protested as she uncurled from her huddled position. Her clothes were still damp but wearable. After dressing quickly, she gathered the medical kit and what remained of her courage. The rising sun provided direction, and Delilah set off toward what she hoped was the trail they had been following before the storm. If Colton was looking for her, he would surely start there. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when a distant sound stopped her in her tracks, the lowing of cattle. Hope surged within her. Following the sound, she crested a small hill and looked down into a valley where the herd was gathered, cowboys moving among them on horseback. Colton, she breathed, relief making her knees weak. They hadn't left without her. As she started down toward them, movement in the trees to her left caught her attention. A flash of color, a murmur of voices. Delilah froze, then slowly backed into the cover of the trees. Peering carefully around a trunk, she saw what she had feared. The raiders from the day before, now 5 in number, observing the cattle drive from concealment. At least 50 head, one was saying. More than we've taken all month. The men? Asked another. 8, including the trail boss, replied the scarred man. We outnumber them, and we have surprise on our side. They were planning to attack, to steal the cattle and likely kill anyone who resisted. To kill Colton. Without conscious thought, Delilah began moving parallel to the raiders, staying hidden among the trees. She needed to warn the camp, but a direct approach would reveal her to the raiders. Instead, she circled wide, approaching the valley from the opposite direction. As she reached the edge of the trees on the far side, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Delilah struggled wildly until a familiar voice spoke directly into her ear. It's me. It's Colton. Be still. He released her, and Delilah turned to find not only Colton but 3 of his men, all armed and moving silently through the trees. Raiders, she gasped. On the north ridge. 5 of them. They're planning to attack the camp. Colton's expression hardened. We know. Rodriguez spotted them an hour ago. His eyes searched her face. Are you hurt? We found the wagon. I thought. His voice faltered, and for a moment the cool competence of the trail boss gave way to something rawer. I'm all right, she assured him. But they're going to attack soon. Not if we have anything to say about it. He turned to his men. Get her back to camp. Tell Harrison to move the herd west. Now. Jones, circle around to warn the others. We're ending this today. As the men moved to obey, Colton turned back to Delilah. Stay with the camp. No matter what you hear, stay with the camp. Colton, he caught her hand, his grip urgent. Promise me. The fear in his eyes, fear for her, she realized, stopped her protest. I promise. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. As one of Colton's men escorted Delilah back to the camp, shouts and the crack of gunfire erupted from the direction of the North Ridge. The cattle, already nervous from the previous day's storm, began to mill anxiously. Men scrambled for weapons and positions. "Get the herd moving," ordered Harrison, the foreman. Everyone else, defensive positions. Delilah found herself thrust into the chuck wagon, hastily salvaged from her accident, as it lurched into motion alongside the cattle. Through gaps in the canvas cover, she caught glimpses of riders exchanging fire, of men taking shelter behind rocks and trees. And then she saw him, Colton, on horseback, pursuing one of the raiders who had broken away from the main group and was heading directly toward the moving herd. Even at a distance, she recognized the scarred face of the leader. The two men disappeared from view as the wagon rounded a bend in the trail. When they reappeared, they were much closer, both dismounted and locked in struggle. The raider had Colton pinned against a boulder, a knife gleaming in his hand as he drove it toward Colton's chest. Without thinking, Delilah leapt from the moving wagon, stumbling as she hit the ground. The medical kit, still somehow in her possession after everything, flew open, scattering supplies. Her hand closed around a heavy glass bottle. Running toward the struggling men, Delilah raised the bottle high and brought it down with all her strength on the back of the raider's head. The man collapsed instantly, the knife falling harmlessly to the ground. Colton stared at her in shock, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "I told you to stay with the camp." "You're welcome," Delilah retorted, her hands shaking from the violence of what she had just done. A shot rang out, and Colton yanked her down beside him as a bullet whizzed overhead. "This isn't over," he said grimly, reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Stay down." The gunfight that followed seemed to last both forever and mere seconds. When it finally ended, 2 raiders lay dead, 1 wounded, and 2 had fled. Among Colton's men, there were injuries, but, miraculously, no fatalities. As Delilah moved among the wounded, applying bandages and administering what medicines she had salvaged, she was acutely aware of Colton watching her. The intensity in his gaze made her hands falter more than once. Finally, when the immediate crisis had passed and the herd was safely on the move again, he approached her by the newly established campfire. "You saved my life," he said without preamble. Delilah looked up from wiping blood from her hands. "As you saved my aunt's. Consider us even." "It's not about being even." He crouched beside her. "It's about what happened out there. You could have been killed, Delilah. So could you." She met his gaze steadily. "Did you expect me to stand by and watch it happen?" "I expected you to stay safe," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "I've been searching for you since the storm. When we found the wagon empty, with signs of raiders nearby." He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I'd lost you before I ever really had you." The raw emotion in his voice stripped away Delilah's carefully maintained defenses. "I was afraid too," she admitted quietly. "Not just of the raiders, or being lost. I was afraid you wouldn't come looking for me at all." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Because of Preston." She nodded, unable to voice the fear that had haunted her. "Delilah." Colton took her hands in his, heedless of the dirt and blood that still stained them. "I am not Samuel Preston. I would never leave someone I care about behind, especially not you." "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know enough." His grip tightened. "I know you're brave enough to join a cattle drive to save your aunt's home. I know you're skilled enough to tend wounds that would make grown men faint. I know you're selfless enough to risk your life for others." His voice softened. "And I know that from the moment I saw you in Timber Creek, something in me recognized something in you." The walls around Delilah's heart, built brick by brick since Samuel's betrayal, began to crumble. "I felt it too," she confessed. "But I was afraid to trust it. To trust any man again." "Then don't trust words," Colton said. "Trust actions. Judge me by what I do, not what I say." He released her hands and stood. "Starting now, we're getting this herd to Helena as fast as possible, and then we're going back to Timber Creek to deal with Preston." In the days that followed, the cattle drive moved with renewed purpose. The remaining distance to Helena passed without further incident, though Colton insisted on doubling the night watch and keeping Delilah close to camp at all times. What changed most noticeably was not their routine, but the space between them. The careful distance Colton had maintained disappeared, replaced by a quiet intimacy that grew with each shared meal, each conversation beside the evening fire. He never pressed for more than she was ready to give, but his steady presence became a comfort Delilah had not known she was missing. The night before they reached Helena, as they sat watching the stars appear one by one above the camp, Colton spoke of his parents and the home he had left behind after their deaths. "The ranch is still there," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "My uncle runs it now, but the land is still mine. 200 acres in Wyoming territory. Good grazing, a stream that never runs dry." "You never speak of going back," Delilah observed. He was silent for a long moment. It hurt too much at first. Then it just became easier to keep moving. His eyes found hers across the fire. "Until recently." "What changed?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "I did." He set the stick aside. "Or rather, I remembered something my father told me once. He said, 'Son, a man can spend his whole life running from pain, but he'll miss all the joy along the way.' Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. Colton's smile was tinged with sadness. "He also said that when I found the right woman, I'd know because she'd make me want to stop running and start building." The implication hung in the air between them, too new and fragile to acknowledge directly. Instead, Delilah asked, "And what would you build if you stopped running?" "A home," he said simply. "A life. A family." His gaze held hers. "But I wouldn't build it alone." The cattle sold in Helena for a better price than expected, the recent raids having driven up demand for beef. As promised, Colton paid Delilah immediately, the sum generous enough to cover Martha's debts with a small amount remaining. "We leave for Timber Creek at first light," he announced as he handed her the money. "With luck, we'll be there with days to spare before Preston's deadline." Delilah tucked the money carefully into an inner pocket of her dress. "Thank you for this. For everything." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "Preston won't give up easily. Men like him never do." The journey back to Timber Creek took 4 days of hard riding. By the time they arrived, with just 2 days remaining before Martha's deadline, Delilah was saddle-sore and exhausted. But seeing the familiar outline of the boarding house against the evening sky filled her with renewed determination. Martha's joy at her return quickly gave way to concern as Delilah explained everything that had happened. When Colton outlined his plan to confront Preston directly, the older woman shook her head. "Samuel's father has the bank, the sheriff, and half the town council in his pocket," she warned. "This isn't a problem you can solve with a straight talk or even a fist fight, young man." "I'm not planning on either," Colton replied. "I'm planning on using his own tactics against him." The next morning, while Delilah remained at the boarding house reconnecting with Martha, Colton rode out to the Preston ranch alone. What transpired there, he wouldn't fully explain upon his return, saying only, "Let's just say I made him an offer he'd be foolish to refuse." That evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Delilah finally pressed him for details. "What did you say to Preston? What kind of offer?" Colton leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I simply pointed out that his father might be interested to know about certain business dealings his son conducted last winter in Cheyenne." Delilah's eyes widened. "What dealings?" "Let's just say young Preston has a weakness for cards and women that his father wouldn't approve of." His expression grew serious. "I also reminded him that the territory marshal takes a dim view of using falsified documents to seize property, especially when those documents bear the forged signature of a territorial judge." "How did you know about all this?" "Cowboys talk," Colton replied. "And Preston has made enemies up and down the territory. All I had to do was ask the right questions." "And he agreed to leave Aunt Martha alone? Just like that?" "Not exactly." Colton reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper, which he handed to Delilah. "He agreed to sell your aunt's mortgage to me, at the original price without interest." Delilah stared at the document, then at Colton. "You bought the mortgage? With what money?" "The same money I've been saving for 5 years." He shrugged, as if the gesture were insignificant. "I was planning to use it to restock my ranch when I finally went home. This seemed more important." Stunned, Delilah looked back at the paper in her hands. "Colton, I can't let you do this. It's too much." "You're not letting me do anything," he said gently. "It's already done. And it's not a gift, it's an investment." An investment in what? He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. In a future. In possibilities. His voice dropped lower. In us, if you'll consider it. Delilah's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm tired of drifting. That I want to go home to Wyoming, to rebuild what my parents started. His grip on her hand tightened. And I'm saying that I can't imagine doing it without you beside me. Colton, we've known each other barely a month, she protested, even as hope blossomed within her. And in that month, we've faced storms, raiders, and Samuel Preston together, he countered. I've seen your courage and your heart, Delilah. I know who you are. And what about Martha? I can't leave her. Who said anything about leaving her? The house in Wyoming has plenty of room, and I suspect she might enjoy helping run a ranch. His smile was warm. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm not even formally asking for your hand yet, though that day will come, if you'll let it. What are you asking then? Delilah's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm asking you to believe that not every promise ends in betrayal, that not every man leaves. He reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. I'm asking you to consider that your forever might start with me. The words struck a chord deep within Delilah, resonating with a truth she had been fighting since the moment Colton Irwin had saved her aunt from a runaway wagon. The wall around her heart, already crumbling, collapsed completely. I believe you, she said, her voice stronger now. And I'm not afraid anymore. His smile could have outshone the setting sun. Then that's enough for now. 3 days later, Samuel Preston left Timber Creek for good, rumors of his father's displeasure following in his wake. The boarding house remained in Martha's hands, now free of debt, and with a new lease on life as Delilah's seamstress business began to flourish. Colton stayed, taking odd jobs around town and making regular visits to check on his ranch in Wyoming. Each time he returned, he brought news of improvements, a repaired roof, fresh paint, new livestock. And each time he returned, the space between him and Delilah grew smaller, the future they might share more clearly defined. 6 months to the day after the cattle drive, Colton led Delilah to the small church at the edge of town, the same church where she had once stood alone in a wedding dress, heart shattered. Why are we here? She asked, hesitating at the steps. To reclaim this place, he said simply. To replace bad memories with good ones. Inside, the church was empty except for Martha, who waited near the altar with a knowing smile. Beside her stood the minister. Colton turned to face Delilah, taking both her hands in his. From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. I promised I would ask formally when the time was right, he said. That time is now. Tears filled Delilah's eyes as he knelt before her. Delilah Jenkins, I love you. I have loved you since you tended my wounded arm and looked at me with eyes that saw past every wall I'd built. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Once, someone left you standing here alone. I promise to stand beside you for all the days of my life, if you'll have me as your husband. Through her tears, Delilah smiled. Yes, she said simply. Yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Colton rose and drew her close. Your forever starts with me, he whispered against her hair. And mine with you. 1 year later, Delilah Irwin stood on the porch of a ranch house in Wyoming Territory, watching the sun set behind mountains that had become as familiar as the face of the man who now approached from the barn. Colton's smile still made her heart race, even after months of marriage. The new foal is doing well, he reported, coming to stand beside her. His arm slipped around her waist, hand resting gently on the curve of her belly where their first child grew. Strong legs. He'll make a fine horse one day. Like his father, Delilah teased, leaning into his embrace. From inside the house came the sound of Martha's laughter as she prepared the evening meal. The older woman had taken to ranch life with surprising enthusiasm, declaring the mountain air better for my old bones than that dusty town ever was. Any regrets? Colton asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. About leaving Timber Creek? About choosing this life? Delilah turned in his arms to face him, thinking of the journey that had brought them here. The storm, the raiders, the confrontation with Samuel. Each challenge had only strengthened the bond between them, proving that what they had built together could withstand whatever came their way. Not one, she said with absolute certainty. My forever started with you, Colton Irwin, and it gets better every day. As the last light of day faded from the sky, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that held both promise and fulfillment, the promise of all the days to come, and the fulfillment of a love that had begun with a chance encounter and a rescued aunt. In the vastness of the Wyoming frontier, they had found what so many sought but few discovered, not just a home, but a heart to come home to.